out. I don't know, sometimes, what do you make of Samson as a character? Like, he lives this very full life, I think would be the polite way of describing it. And unlike most of the characters in Judges, we've got a fair bit of detail about him as an individual. Like, somewhat unusually, we get insight into his actual thought process. We hear about his loves. We hear some of his prayers. He's a larger-than-life kind of guy. He's a little bit dangerous. He's clearly got a temper. He would probably be on ASIO's watch list if he was living in our times, because I think he's a bit of a one-man terrorist. We hear him crack jokes and riddles. He's out there with the boys, you know, at his wedding. And we hear his final tragic prayer. He's got a pretty interesting relationship with God. Like, we really see the humanity of Samson. And I know some people have explored the idea as to whether, you know, we should revise our view of Samson, that, you know, everything he did was faithful and God was using him and it's all positive. I don't hold that. I think the record pretty clearly, particularly in the context of Judges and the narrative flow that we talked about last time, it's presenting us with a picture for a reason, a picture which we don't have up on screen. That's not an attractive picture. I do apologise. Parents should have done better on that. Yes, the Spirit worked with Samson and through Samson on Samson, but that doesn't mean that everything Samson did was right, good and proper. The fact that he's included in Hebrews chapter 11 is fantastic because it gives us hope, right? We shouldn't be denigrating Samson by any, in any way, shape or form, but at the same time we shouldn't whitewash over his record. You know, we need to sort of get it in perspective. So we'll see Samson get into inappropriate sexual relationships. He marries a Philistine. He goes down and he sees a prostitute. He ultimately falls in love with Delilah, a woman who's, quite avaricious, sells him out for money. We see him, act in revenge. We see him go out and just indiscriminately destroy economic prospects and food of the Philistines, and probably Israelites as well. He'll betray every single aspect of his covenant, as a Nazarite. Ultimately, finally, of course, his hair. And finally, when he dies, his identity is, how distinct from the Philistines? Not very. As a judge and a leader of the nation, he's reflected all of their weaknesses and dies among the Philistines, thinking himself one of them. Who would continue with Samson? Like, if we had a Samson in our life, how long would we tolerate that sort of character? Not very long. But God continues to work with Samson as an individual. And ultimately, he's there in Hebrews 11 as one of the faithful judges that God worked with and through, which is fantastic. God, doesn't excuse Samson's flaws, but works with the faith that he did have. And I think that gives us a tremendous amount of hope. The Philistines are my favourite baddies in the Bible. Like, I just really rate them. I love their attitude. Paul quotes that section where they're going out on if you remember the incident, it's when, pre-Samuel, early in the chapters of Samuel, and the Israelites go and they're like, right, the Philistines are coming. What we need to do is get the Ark of the Covenant. And the Philistines are freaking out. And they're going, they've brought the magic box. We're done. And they turn and look at each other and they go, look, okay, they've got the magic box. We're done for, but we're not going to die like slaves. Let's, live as slaves. We'd rather die as men. And Paul picks it up and says, quit like men. Don't give up. Always push forward. And that's what the Philistines were like. They had an awesome rugby team and their basketball team was pretty handy too. They actually came out of the Sea People's peace. So historically, the time of the Judges happened at the late Bronze collapse, that period of time. The Philistines were part of the Sea Peoples. One of the few times the Sea Peoples were actually defeated was 1190, Ramses III, pretty handy king of Pharaoh of Egypt, and he settled them in Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath. So he put them there into the land of Canaan as mercenaries under his control. And Philistines got a Philistine, so after 40 years they went up your nose with a rubber hose, we're going to go our own way, and threw off the Egyptian control. Anyway, I thought it was pretty interesting following their history back. It's a fairly warlike group, and clearly they had the technological advantage over Israel. Now, we know the pattern of the Judges, and we should be alert when we read Scripture as to when those patterns change, when something suddenly doesn't appear. So the pattern of Judges, the spiral downwards, they sin, they start suffering, they turn to God, he raises up a judge, and then, the judge saves them. They do the right thing while the judge lives. That's the pattern that gets repeated time and time and time again. But when we get to the start of Samson's life, the pattern gets broken. Something's missing. There's no mention. If you look in Judges chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, and you might want to have Judges 13 and then 14, 15 open, just to make sure I don't cheat too much. Judges chapter 13, the Israelites did evil again in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. There was a man named Manoah. Off we go. Couple of things break the pattern, or should stand out to us. Firstly, there's no mention of suffering. Where's the oppression? It's not mentioned. And where is the call? Right? Where is the call for deliverance to God? Where is the people repenting and saying to God, help? Doesn't exist. And the third thing that sort of jumps out at me from that verse is they suffer under the Philistines for 40 years. Now, we mentioned last week, 40 years was the ideal length of time for a righteous judge or leader or king to be over the nation of Israel. But this time it's completely inverted. You've got the Philistines in charge for 40 years, which is the longest period of oppression that happens. And they don't call out for any salvation. Why not? Well, I guess there's two possible reasons as to why they haven't done that. That was not meant to happen. Either the Philistine leadership is somewhat benevolent, so they've lost their sense of national identity and destiny, or perhaps they've just given up. Not sure. But something radical is required. And again, back to the mercy of God. Israel's not even looking for a saviour, but he's going to provide one. Okay, a little bit of background, because it matters. In Judges chapter 13, Manoah, who is Samson's dad, is in Zorah. Now, Zorah is smack bang in the original part of the land of Canaan that was given to the tribe of Dan. So if on the map you can see, I'm not confident that that will work. No, that didn't work. Really badly didn't work. So if you can see the light blue, the aqua section that includes Joppa in there, that's where Dan's territory is, right? So it's smack bang in the middle of the land. Now, historically, they weren't there. Because we know when we read Judges 18, which is historically out of order, that the tribe of Dan had a tough time taking that territory, too close to the Philistines. So they got together in Zorah and Eshtaol, held a bit of a council and said, this place is too tough, we're headed north. So all of the tribe of Dan had actually left and gone north, apart from Manoah and his family. Right? So Manoah's family is a small remnant of Dan that have stuck it out in their tribal inheritance. And it's right, Samson's brought up right in the heart of Dan's territory by this family who historically refused to walk away from their inheritance. So life for them, life in discipleship, life in serving God was tough, but they stuck it out. They weren't going to head off to greener pastures. They stayed behind. They're right there on the border of the Philistine country. They'd been deserted by friends and family and, quite close to the Philistines. The Philistines didn't stay on the coast. There were times they came all the way up across the Jordan. In fact, they controlled one of the hill forts, Bet Shan, right up until the reign of David. So the Philistines, really were cutting up that tribe of Dan. The grass looked a lot greener up north. That's why everybody had left, apart from Manoah and his family. They stayed behind. And when the time was right, 40 years of oppression from the Philistines, when the time was right, God was going to use that family. I think there's something in that for us to think about sometimes, because we, will face situations in life where we think, well, that looks pretty good over there. That looks a lot easier, a lot more prosperous than what I'm perhaps enduring at the moment. I'm not saying that God's going to work through you or work through me specifically, but we don't know. Manoah and his family stuck it out, stayed in place. And when God needed a partner to bring salvation to Israel, they were right where he needed them to be. I think there's something about sticking it out, toughing it out, that Manoah and that family demonstrated. Well, Judges 13 records the birth of Samson, and basically, Samson's name essentially means sunshine. Now, what I've put up on screen there is, there's a very common trope through Scripture of the miracle baby, and Samson fits straight into this standard story, this standard pattern. And usually the elements are something like there's a barren woman, there's suffering, usually at a national level, but occasionally that's at a family level. There's a messenger from God, an answered prayer, and then there's a special child, the miracle baby who comes on to advance God's purpose or save the nation. Pretty good list to have your name up there in that list of miracle babies, eh? Like the patriarchs, Joseph, saved the family, saved the world. Samuel, the last judge, first prophet. John the Baptist, forerunner of the Lord. Obviously the last two, Samson and family, weren't aware of. But it's quite a collection of significant characters. One of them probably a bit of a disappointment. I was born into a religious family. I suspect a lot of you were probably born into religious families too. There's a weight of expectation that goes with that. I wasn't a miracle baby. You saw the picture before, you're looking at it now. But the weight of expectation, feeling like our life is mapped out spiritually. We'll go to Sunday school, then, one day we'll youth group, and then one day we get baptised, and then chink, 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 and on it goes, and feeling like that's all mapped out. And that can put a lot of pressure on us, put a lot of pressure on our kids. Sometimes we might feel like kicking back against that. And I know a lot of people, my peers and others, people do. Thankfully, not too many of us kick quite as hard as Samson. But there's plenty of times where we might ask, like, why me? Why am I, my whole life has been going this way, and we want to perhaps run away or take a break, or it feels like it's a bit heavy. And that's understandable. I think that's a real thing. The name missing from that list, of course, is Jesus. The miracle baby. He knew from, I don't know, how old was the Lord when he knew where he was headed, how this was going to play out. If weight of expectation, all of history was resting on his shoulders, all of the faithful men and women of old, everyone that was to come, all depended on him following through with his mission that he was born to. I think it just, when sometimes we might feel like we're caught in a channel and maybe we have had not the choice we would have liked, or think about Christ carrying that burden all of his life. What an amazing individual he was. If anyone understood the weight of destiny, it was the Lord. In Judges 13, I'd love to spend a little bit of time on Judges 13 and Manoah's wife and what was going on in that family, because their relationship appears interesting. I was talking with David before. I think she was the brains of the family, which is why the angel's appearing to her. Her husband's having panic attacks and not being very logical, but anyway. Samson was a Nazir from birth, a Nazirite. The word Nazir, it just means someone who is dedicated. And the whole Nazirite vow, which included all the things that applied to Samson, is mentioned in Numbers chapter 6. And essentially, it just enabled you to dedicate a period of your life to God. It could be a week, it could be a month, it could be 10 years, it could be until Australia wins the World Cup. It could be any period of time you wanted, right? That was up to you. Now, Samson, whilst he's not explicitly called a Nazirite, the word Nazir is used of him a number of times, here at his birth, and then also in his final confession to Delilah. He talks about himself being Nazir, being one dedicated. Samson didn't choose to be the one who would begin to deliver Israel. He didn't choose to be a miracle baby. He didn't choose to be a Nazirite from birth. Now, under the law in Numbers chapter 6, the key part of being a Nazirite was choice. You chose to do it voluntarily, and you picked how long you were going to do it. And, it ended. And at the end of the vow, you'd shave your hair off, you'd burn your hair and do the sacrifices and celebrate with the priest. That's how it worked. If you accidentally broke your vow, you had to restart. So if you had said, I'm going to do 6 months, you accidentally touched a dead body after 2 months, well, shave your head, and restart the clock. You've got to get through your 6 months afresh. Samson, however, didn't have any way out. His was a lifelong commitment that he never signed up for. And I wonder whether that played into his behaviour patterns. There's a whole lot of... I went down quite a rabbit hole looking at people doing psychoanalysis on Samson. Unfortunately, you can't put him on the couch, but let's just say a lot of people find a lot of the behaviours quite unhealthy, disturbing. But he was born as a dedicated child, right? He was born as a Nazir. And as I said, I think that weighed on him pretty heavily, probably more heavily than the gates of Gaza. It certainly seems to influence his behaviour and his relationships. In Judges chapter 13, verse 24 and 25, we, having seen Manoah and more specifically Manoah's wife and her faithfulness, we start to read about the growing of Samson to maturity. So verse 24 starts off really great. Manoah's wife gave birth to a son, named him Samson. The child grew and the Lord empowered him. Excellent. Very promising beginning. Exactly what you want for a miracle baby. I didn't perhaps appreciate what the next verse was actually trying to say. Verse 25, the Lord's Spirit began to control him in Mahanaim Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol, which of course is right in that heartland of Dan's allotted territory. Now on the surface, it appears to be saying like all the good things, right? The Lord empowered him as he grew, and the Lord's Spirit began to, and it depends on your translation, some translations say move, stirred, control, like controlled him in this area. Okay. Well, it is a little bit odd. That verb that's used in verse 25 for the Spirit coming on Samson and moving him is not the Hebrew that's usually applied to the Spirit of God empowering the judges. Right? And later on, the normal word will be used for Samson. But it's a different word here. It's an unusual word. It's only used a couple of times. It's used of two other individuals. And in each case, God's Spirit had moved, but it had been a bad experience. Example number one is Pharaoh. Right? When Pharaoh, at the time of Joseph, has the dream about, the 7 thin corn ears and the 7 fat ones and then 7 fat cows and thin cows and probably a pump that was underwater in the Nile or something from this morning. I understand all that. It says that Pharaoh woke up and he was distressed, and it's this word, like the Spirit was like shaking him, pounding him, and he was very agitated. Right? It wasn't working in concert with God's Spirit. God's Spirit was disturbing him. The other time it's used is Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, I think someone immediately went, oh, same thing. Has that vision of that fearsome image, and it's got seriously wound him up, and he's frightened and concerned and distressed about the operation of that vision of God's Spirit in his life. The word is based on the idea of beating, and a couple of the derivative nouns are like an anvil, something that you pound against. So Samson grew and was blessed by God, but I think the record's saying that not everything was perfect here. Samson is wrestling with this. He's getting pounded by the Spirit and controlled, and there's a struggle going on, a conflict. And then he goes down. The record says then he goes down. He goes down towards Timnath. Just like the nation he was meant to deliver, there's a whole sequence of events that follows that is triggered by Samson making a decision based on what is right in his own eyes, by seeing something, and his parents protest to no avail, don't go marrying that Philistine girl, find someone within the camp, can't do that. And I just think, his poor mum. She was keeping the Nazirite vow herself, at least for the period of pregnancy. And clearly she had spiritual discernment. And now she's seeing her boy that she would have placed so much hope in, following his eyes like the nation, going down. Judges 14 verse 3, he sees the woman, she's right in his eyes. It's the same expression that's used of Israel 4 times through the back half of Judges. The judge and the people have got the same problem. They're making decisions based on their eyes. I'm not sure if you can quite see here. There's still, they are actually vineyards in Timnath today, and there are still dangerous but strangely attractive women who are wandering through that countryside. She told me I wasn't allowed to mention her by name. The pottery that's shown there, by the way, is actually Philistine pottery, drinking jugs. So it's actually beer jugs and wine receptacles that the Philistines had. So when Samson is at the wedding and there's drinking and whatever else going on, it would have been pottery jugs looking very much like that. Judges 14 verse 4 is an interesting verse, as his parents were wrestling with what was going on and where this was all going. Now his father and his mother didn't realise that this was the Lord's doing, because he was looking for an opportunity to stir up trouble with the Philistines. For that time the Philistines were ruling Israel. Does that mean that God endorsed Samson marrying a foreigner? That Samson doing what was right in his own eyes was actually in line with God's purpose, was what God desired? I don't think so. I think that runs completely contrary to the larger narrative and context of this, which is, right from the get-go, Moses saying, pre-Joshua, do not intermarry with the people of the land. Stay separate from them. Joshua repeats the same message. And then you have the same thing being repeated again in Judges chapter 2, telling the people to maintain separation. Judges 2 verse 6 specifically points to intermarriage as problematic. So it's just inconceivable, it's inconsistent to see that verse 4 means that God was happy with this opportunity. It wasn't that God was pleased with what Samson was deciding. It's merely that God is going to use that to accomplish his purpose. Samson was, a Danite, and more than a normal Israelite, he's a Nazarite. He's meant to be a cut above the rest. If anyone should have understood the need for separation and dedication, it was a Nazarite. But Samson clearly doesn't do it. But God will work with it. God will work with Samson's failures and Samson's mistakes. But look at how that panned out. Right? Verse 4 says, God was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. But we're not going to read through the story tonight. Didn't have a reading because I just didn't want to read all the chapters. I'm just going to take it that we all know the basic story. Right? Samson goes, and his first action against the Philistines is what? He goes down to Ashkelon, I think it is, and he kills 30 men to steal their clothes to pay a gambling debt. That's the first action of Samson as a judge, using the power of God to make a difference, is to pay a gambling debt. It's not an auspicious start, is it? And then, he doesn't exactly get a wake-up call. He exits stage left. Right? Samson doesn't do anything further. He doesn't go and rally the nation to come and fight against the Philistines, having realised that they're evil. Look what's happened to me. I got my fingers burnt. I've made a mistake. I should go and get Israel, get the Danites that exist, the Judites, and we'll go and we'll get rid of the Philistines. He doesn't do that. He just goes home to mum and dad. Right? Samson's missing something as a leader. You got the quote up on the screen from 1 Peter. We're not Nazarites per se, but we are meant to be different. We are meant to be dedicated as well. Right? The Lord Jesus Christ in John chapter 17, when he's giving that final prayer, talking about his disciples, praying for his disciples, he says, well, the world's going to hate them because the disciples don't belong to the world, to the cosmos, to the order of things as it is. John 17:14. The disciples should be set apart in truth, verse 17. The word is to sanctify us, to make us holy, to make us dedicated to God, to make us different. Not that we necessarily have got long hair, even if we're still capable of it, but we ought to be different in our behaviour and identity, just like Samson was meant to be. And, it's not because we're special people, but we do have a special message. We do have a special dispensation from God because we have this transformational gospel. When I started out my discipleship and when you started yours, there was an enthusiasm. There was a clarity as to how we saw things. Now, okay, I was a kid. Some of us were a bit more mature when we got baptised. But things were really black and white. And sometimes maybe a little bit too much youthful zeal and not enough nuance and understanding and all of that. Some of those lines were probably in silly places at times, absolutely. Some of them probably still are for me. But the priorities were clear and simple. And as life goes on, it's easy for us, or a danger for us perhaps, is to start to see things a little bit more grey, to let some of the thorns and thistles emerge in the garden that shouldn't perhaps be there, to cloud our judgment, cloud our vision, to blur the lines a little, like Samson not keeping that crisp dedication that he was meant to embody, as should we. And the danger, I guess, is that, well, maybe my opinions might be better informed, but maybe my opinions are just a little more convenient. Maybe my behaviour is less uptight, but maybe actually my behaviour is just less distinct. Maybe it's easier. So the challenge is for us to be the light on the hill, to be dedicated. That's what Samson's calling was. But Peter says we're a chosen people too. We're also called to be chosen, to be distinct, to show God's holiness. Samson blurred the lines, and we know how that worked out. Terribly, right? In Judges 14, his wife was given to someone else. So in a completely rational and calm response, he gets 300 jackals and he goes and burns the entire countryside down. Now, I don't know practically how he did that. I suspect it was probably multiple nights involved in doing that process. I mean, it'd be pretty hard to catch 300 jackals in one go. So I'm going to guess he caught 50 odd, put them in a cage, built another cage a few kilometres up the road, caught another 50, then he had to go back and feed cage 1, feed cage 2, build cage 3, put another 50 in. He's only halfway done. Potentially it took him quite a bit of time to get this entire plot together, and then there was the big night where he, raced from cage to cage and set them all off. I think he had some serious anger issues. And then, of course, the woman and everyone else gets killed. He does have a bit of a fight. But then we see what happens after all of this in Judges chapter 15, verse 8, right? This first act of Samson's life where he's lost the distinction, he's blurred the lines. What happens? How does it finish up? He leaves. He goes and hides in a cave in the territory of Judah, right? It says he was in the cliff of Etam, in a cave in that area. So he's actually left his tribal allotment. He's not struck a blow against the Philistines. He's got revenge for himself, sure, for his wounded pride. But has he actually done anything to deliver Israel? No. He's gone missing in action. He's left Dan. He's gone into the tribe of Judah. He's hiding in a cliff a cave in the rocks. That is not what God intended. And why is he there? Because the sanctified one followed his eyes. He did what was right in his own eyes. He didn't follow the dedication. He didn't show God's holiness. He was no different to the enemies of God. And his actions were driven by personal revenge. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, God will use Samson. And God ultimately in the story will save Samson. But when we blur the lines like Samson, sometimes our fingers can get burnt. And it can cost us. And it certainly cost him. He was down. He thought he was out. I think he had abandoned the post. But Samson gets given more opportunities, and the next time he gets a chance, it's going to hurt, but it will still be a chance. I don't know why in the olden days they always fought in the buff, but all of the artists demonstrate that that's what happened, so I'm sure they're accurate with their depictions. The second half of Judges chapter 15, Samson, he's abandoned ship, he's living in a cave, and he thought to himself, well, the war's over, got to go home, got to get away, it's done. But it wasn't done for the Philistines. Samson had destroyed their crops, their grain harvests, the vineyards, olive groves, and it at least in that broken the spirit of Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 20. Weren't allowed to cut down food providing trees, but Samson didn't worry too much about those things. So you have 3,000 men of Judah come to Samson in acquiescence to the Philistine demands, tie him up and deliver him to the Philistines. Don't worry, we won't hurt you, they say, as they hand him over to people who want to kill him. Love the integrity, guys. We know what Samson does. He grabs the jawbone of the ass and then he proceeds to knock down or kill, it's a bit unclear which, 1,000 of them. And Samson once again demonstrates how much of a joker he is, right? In the first incident with the girl from Timnah, he makes up a riddle. In Judges 15 verse 16, he's got another word play because the Hebrew word for donkey and heap are almost identical. So as one translator says, his victory chant essentially says, with a donkey's jawbone, I made donkeys of them. Samson likes to play with words. That's what he does. Might be being a bit harsh on Samson, but I think it's fair. But just consider where Samson ends up after this, right? Samson has deserted his post. He's fled into this cave, stayed there. He's then betrayed by the men of Judah. Now, if the men of Judah could put 3,000 blokes in the field, you would expect they ought to be able to stand up against the Philistines at least a little bit. But they don't do that. They betray him. They turn him in. And, then something amazing happens as God works through Samson. And it's there in chapter 15, verse 20. Rather than go back to his cave, rather than, scold the men of Judah for being cowards or betraying him or whatever else, Samson actually hits the highlight of his career. He judges Israel for 20 years, says the record. Now, betrayal's awful, especially when it's, your own people, your own family. But Samson moved past it. Samson was betrayed by the men of Judah, but that actually is the trigger for him judging Israel, doing his job for 20 years. All right, so as much as we might appear to be criticising the big man, he had a big enough heart that rather than take it out against the men of Judah, he actually goes on to embrace his role. If his mum was still alive, I think she would have been proud at this point. Now, admittedly, it's not the 40 years of a great leader, but it's 20. He's halfway there, right? He's doing the right thing. And this is the high point of Samson's career. This is the best of Samson. And ideally, we would just close the book and go home because, Samson finishes on a high point, right? This is it. This is the good part. But unfortunately, there's more still to come. But the man is doing his job at this point, so credit to him. Unfortunately, we get chapter 16, which is the chapter that Samson would prefer that we didn't have access to. And what happens is Samson, of course, is repeating the storyline. Once again, there's a woman involved that he sees with his eyes, and it gets worse. He goes down to Philistine territory, sees a woman. 20 years of success Samson has had, 20 years. And it's undone by a moment of weakness. It's destroyed by a moment of weakness. And the Hebrew where he goes down to that woman in Gaza, to the prostitute, it's used almost invariably in the context of sexual activity, which most translations reflect. My beloved wife is a huge fan of old dead rocks, as she lovingly calls them. The picture of the dead rocks there is actually the gate of Megiddo. It's a very, very common late bronze fortification structure. The top one is standing inside the city, looking at on the street out of the city, and so you can sort of see the inlets are there. And then the next view is turning 90 degrees, and you can see you've got the wall on the left of the pitch down the bottom. Left? Yep. And then you've got these chambers. That's where the guards would have been sitting waiting for Samson, because it's the same structure at Gath, same design. And during the day, that's where there'd be benches, people would be sitting, chatting, doing commerce, watching people come and go. The judges of the city would be there. So that's sort of just try and give you some idea as to what it looked like. The gates that you can see there, those wooden gates, they actually come from a city which is called Balawat. They were built in about 880 BC. They're Assyrian gates, right? So you go, oh, that's not too useful. Why don't you have the gates of Gath, Daniel? Because someone took them away. But the walls of Gath and of that city are the same height. They were 7 metres high, right? So that's myself and Caleb when he was much smaller on the bottom right of that picture. They've recovered, the brass bands are original, but the British Museum, having flogged all the good stuff, got some wood and reconstructed the size of the gates. It gives you an idea of how tall and how heavy those gates were, right? So not the actual gates of Gath, but same height, same basic model, right? So he wasn't, grabbing a couple of doors on his back. They're probably 6.8 to 7 metres high, right? Enormous structure. So clearly empowered by God's Spirit, and they used to swing on. You can sort of see the basic structure, almost like the poles on the outside that it would pivot on, and then a beam to hold it shut. Anyway. Clearly with Samson we get tremendous and slightly, I guess embarrassing if we think about it too much. The reality is for many of us, we can identify with Samson because sexual lust is a real thing that affects many of our lives. And Scripture gives a lot of instruction to people about it. Proverbs is full of warnings about strange women. Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes. I made a deliberate decision. How did that righteous man deal with it? He made a decision to look away before problems ever started. And Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, pursue righteousness, faithfulness, love, in peace with others who call on the Lord, but flee from youthful lusts. Flee from youthful lusts. I thought this was something, I thought lust was something that would stop when I got married. Then I thought it was something that would stop when I got, a bit older and more mature, and it just seems to keep on going. And I can't imagine too many men or too many people generally go through life without a failure of the eyes, and there's plenty of opportunities to stray in real life and digitally everywhere these days. That's a reality, and I'm super uncomfortable talking about it. But it's a reality that is something that's true for us today, and we see the impact of that in Samson's life and what that can cost, what that can do. The good news, well, I guess the bad news for Samson, he undid 20 years of good work with one lapse. Something which we need to take seriously. The good news, though, even at midnight, when he's likely just come from the prostitute's bed, Samson accomplishes what can only be called a miracle. No one's lifting those gates and walking out of Gaza at night without God being with them. Which, when we bear in mind where he'd just come from, is even more incredible. You can talk about grace and songs and things, but when we actually see how God works in people's lives, that is genuinely incredible. And, to take those massive gates uphill, the record says he took them towards Hebron. Not humanly possible. It's a vertical climb of about 940 metres. It's something like 62 kilometres if he went the whole distance. He said he took them part way, right? Incredible feat. Samson, or maybe we should say God, plucks victory from the jaws of defeat. Again here I have to just question Samson a tiny bit though, so forgive me for this. If you've just taken the gates of your enemies, right, you're thinking straight away the promises to Abraham, your seed will possess the gates of his enemies. You're thinking about, how Moses told Joshua that you'll go in and take the land and I'll be with you. One man will put 1,000 to flight. Like, this is the opportunity. Go to the men of Judah, they've got 3,000 blokes in the army, and go and clean out the city of Gaza. It's got no gates left anyway. Samson doesn't do that. He seems just to, never quite takes the next step of taking the people, the nation with him. Anyway, that's unfortunate. But when we mess up, when we find ourselves in Gaza and God comes for us, we need to work with the momentum that generates. Don't let it go, don't let it dissipate. And I think Samson let it dissipate. He just moved on to the next failure, as opposed to taking that opportunity to work with God, to change the narrative, to change the direction of the story. Because God can work with us in the most unlikely of circumstances. And we can change the narrative if we seize that opportunity. Well, Samson unfortunately didn't take the opportunity, and he goes straight into his next final fatal mistake. When Samson made up the riddle when he was in his marriage to the Canaanite, the Philistine girl, he makes up this riddle about honey in the dead lion carcass in Judges 14, and the Philistines were stumped until they pressure it out of the girl and the like. But you notice the Philistines actually, when they give an answer to Samson, they themselves kind of give a riddle. In Judges 14 verse 18 they say, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" If I gave that to you as a riddle, how would you answer it? Don't know? Oh, you lose, you're dead. Next. Love. Love. Which I think is the narrator actually playing a little bit with words and ideas in this, because what is going to take down Samson? Love. What's sweeter than honey and stronger than a lion? He started with a riddle. The answer is given a riddle back in exchange. But love actually is those two things. And love was going to be his undoing when the third woman comes into his life. The one he married, the prostitute, and now the one who's going to sell him out. Delilah's not ethnically identified. We don't know if she's a Philistine or an Israelite. Just don't know. People speculate. We're not told, which is a pretty good clue. Stop guessing. That's not what counts, right? It's not about race. Her name is a little bit disputed. Some people think it means flirtatious or slight. Another one had loose hair. What we don't get, because I don't do Hebrew, and I'm pretty sure none of you do either, is there's actually a wordplay going on with the sound of the names. So in verse 2 and 3 of the chapter, twice each, so 4 times in total, you've got the word night appears, which is, and don't think I'm pronouncing this right, I'm not even going to pretend that I'm trying to do it right, it's something like Layla. And Delilah's name is Layla, right? And I think that's the wordplay that's going on. The commentators pointing to, it's night, it's night, it's night, it's night, and now you've got this woman whose name is Night, right? Delilah. So it's probably not just Samson who's making word puns. There's a phonetic connection that's happening here. But Samson falls in love, and that's the first time we're told it. The rulers of the Philistines approach Delilah. We know the basic story, to betray Samson so they can afflict him. And she agrees to do it for 5 lots of 1,100 pieces of silver. Anyone have an idea just how many years' wages 11,000 pieces of silver is? Have a stab. How many years' wages? 50. Not a bad guess. Bit low. Not a lifetime. It's about 110. 110 years of wages. Times 5. 550. Now, depending on how you do your maths and what you use for a benchmark, let's call it roughly 40 million bucks. Right? It is a gobsmacking amount of money. Right? 550 years' wages. Incidentally, I don't think there's some people try and draw a historic connection between Delilah and Micah's mother in the next chapter, because there's 1,100 pieces of silver involved, but there's hundreds of years difference between the two events. The connection is about a political sellout and then a religious sellout, so no, just move on. We know the story, right? And we know how it basically works between Samson and Delilah. There's this piece where he tells a lie, she acts on it. She nags him a bit, he tells another lie, it acts again. And there's 3 times, and he's bringing it closer and closer and closer, I think, to actually revealing the truth. What's going on? What is Samson doing? Why this self-destruction? Was he just dumb? I don't think he was stupid, to the extent that I think every person who's in love is a little bit deluded. I mean, that goes with the territory, doesn't it? I think he's, in a nice way... There is some comedian who makes the point, the entire basis of love is 2 people have a slightly overinflated opinion of the other person's attractiveness. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. Kind of works. But each time he's getting closer and closer to the truth, right? So first of all, it's the 7 bowstrings. Then it's fresh ropes. Probably he had dreadlocks. And then it's the 7 braids of his hair, which explains the bowstrings. So he's getting closer and closer and closer to the fact that he had these 7 locks of hair, and that was where the issue was. The final part of his vow, which he probably hadn't broken at this point. He knew Delilah would test the lies. Right? We are hopeless. We flirt with temptation. And I think Samson's doing that. He thinks he's in control. We always think we're in control. But we just get a little bit closer and we just flirt a little bit, just a little bit more. We'll be okay. And then something changes the game. And the thing that changed the game for Samson was Delilah realised she was going to have to change tactic. And she just started pulling in the old emotional blackmail. So she exploits his love. She's a real piece of work, isn't she? I mean, you think like Delilah, seriously, if you wanted a secure superannuation plan and to know that life was going to be okay, you've got the strong man of Israel with you. Things will be all right. But she's not interested in that. She's going to sell him out for this fantastic son. And in his confession, he reveals he's consecrated, points to his hair as the key to his strength. It's the only time Samson actually talks about his calling. And some commentators have said, well, here it is. He just has never, ever, ever taken it seriously. From the wedding, the lion carcass, and now, he allows himself to have his hair cut off. It was meant to be cut off, when the vow finished and burnt on the altar. And here it is being cut off in the lap of this woman, this wretch. And of course, his eyes are gouged out. And then he's set to grinding in the prison. That picture, you think, what's that? I'd always imagined Samson in the prison, with those big beams, pushing that beam, walking around in a circle, doing the grinding that way. That wasn't invented for quite a few hundred years after the period of the Judges, like hundreds and hundreds of years. What they actually had, and they found grinding houses, so prisons, where prisoners were given one of these pieces. You'd pour the seeds, the corn, wheat, whatever it's called, in the top, and then you'd basically be kneeling over this thing and turning that wooden peg you can see, and the flour would just come out of that little piece as it is there towards the front. All right. So this is what Samson was dealing with, what he would have been doing. So he wasn't doing leg day pushing that massive beam around. It was probably getting quite a sore back, bending over this thing, turning it around. And of course, sitting there without his eyes, which of course was the entire point of his problem. Now we know, the record points to, the commentator tells us that while he's imprisoned, his hair started to regrow. And of course, knowing Numbers 6, we're like, oh, his vow's restarting. The Philistines wouldn't have realised that. More fool them. So Samson's brought out of the prison. At some point, there's obviously a bit of a celebration going down. Samson's brought out of prison towards the end of chapter 16 to entertain the lords of the Philistines and have something of a feast of Dagon's victory, the Philistine god. Contrary to what you may have heard, we have got no idea what Dagon, the Philistine god, was actually the god of, except we're pretty confident that he's not a fish god or a grain god. It's pretty much, we know what he wasn't. We don't actually know what he was. A 3rd century Mesopotamian god that eventually sort of travelled down into Canaan, and the Philistines adopted him. So, good news, it's not just the Israelites who are adopting local gods, the Philistines did it as well. Not sure that's good news. Anyway, so it's probable that Samson is there in the temple to Dagon, and there's some sort of sacrifice or something going on. Now, the bottom picture there is an excavation in Tel Kassil, and there's another one near Ekron, which is identical, which they've actually found Philistine temples to Dagon, and they're both identical, which is kind of helpful, useful to know. And what you can see in the sort of the picture there is, 2 stones which are sort of roundish that they've got sitting up. That's how where the pillars were. So they'd sit on stone bases, and then there'd be a wooden column going up that was supporting the roof of the house. And that picture up the top is actually a picture from Lane Rittmeyer. Does anyone know Lane or know of Lane?
Yes, I do, yes.
Yeah, there we go. Leon does. It's amazing how often Lane's pictures turn up in Bible dictionaries and stuff. It's really cool.
And he's got a son called Daniel, and we took him out a long time ago.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Personal connection. Well, here he did the picture. Now, often there's conversation as to, well, how big was Samson? I don't think he was that big, because then it might have been about his muscles, but actually, God did it, which is true. God did. You couldn't carry the gates of Gath no matter how big you were. But because we've found these Philistine temples, we pretty much can figure at least Samson's wingspan, because those pillars were 6'6" apart, right? Which means Samson's wingspan is at least, well, it's more than 6.6 because he's then got to push him, right? So I'm just going to say he was 6'9", with a little bit longer wingspan than he was high. Think of some of the large basketball players getting around the place. LeBron James. Yeah, LeBron James is 6'9", but he's got a wingspan of 6'11", I reckon. Yep. So there's people going around today who are very good at jumping in the air, but have got the wingspan that they could reach and push these pillars. So I think Samson was probably, actually quite a tall guy. Not that that takes away from the fact no human could do what he did. It's just by the by. I want to drill into just a small part of this incident of Samson's death. I want to look at Samson's prayer. Verse 28. Remember me, strengthen me. Look at the words he uses. Right? What does he say? Remember me, strengthen me. I can get revenge. My two eyes, let me die. 5 times. It's all about Samson. And the Hebrew in verse 28 is a bit uncertain depending on whether you're a Masoretic text or a Septuagint fanboy. The Masoretic sort of says, let me get revenge from the Philistines for one of my 2 eyes. The Septuagint says, so I can get, with one act of revenge, revenge for my 2 eyes. So it's a bit, it's not clear which it is. But what's very clear is that Samson just wants revenge. Okay? Samson wants revenge. He wants revenge for his eyes. That's what got him into trouble. Has he learnt nothing? Now, think about Samson's prayer, his final prayer, with other famous prayers for help in the Bible. It's a fair contrast. David, when he's going up against the Philistine, when he's going up against Goliath, what's his prayer about? What's he worried about? When David goes into battle against Goliath, he's worried about God's honour and God's victory. Samson's worried about my eyes and my revenge. He wants God to end his suffering. Now, I think it's the only time, or maybe the second time actually, that Samson acknowledges God as the source of his strength. The first time is after the jawbone victory. But the circumstances of him turning to God here, it's because he's afflicted, right? It's not that he's had some spiritual revelation. It's because he's afflicted and he wants revenge. It's a very unusual motivation. It's not what you would call, it's no template prayer, right? This is not some prayer that have you ever heard someone doing a study on prayer saying, now here's a really good example. Let's go to Samson's prayer. All right, why not? Because it's not a great example. But God hears it and God responds. We can look at the Lord's Prayer and think, oh, or we could look at John 17 where Jesus prays and think, oh, my prayer life isn't exactly like that. And then, quite a way down the other end of the spectrum, you've got Samson's prayer. God still hears it. God still responds. It was a pretty self-focused prayer, no template. But he had faith, he had belief that God would act, and God did. That actually gives me a lot of hope. That God can hear a prayer like that. That God can work with someone and respond to something that is self-focused, that motivationally is maybe questionable, but there's a kernel of faith there. He trusted that God would hear him and do something, even if the rest of his thinking might have been, how do we say it, a little rough around the edges. God's grace isn't dependent on us hitting the right standard of prayer. You know, not good enough, can't respond to that one, sorry. Not how God actually works. Sure, we should aim for perfection, but not achieving it doesn't limit God and doesn't define his reach. I think of Peter when he's, steps out of the boat into the waves and he's walking towards Christ. He starts sinking because he doesn't have sufficient faith to stay above the water. The Lord actually chastises him about his lack of faith. But when Peter's in the crisis, all he can get out is, Lord, save me. And Jesus intervenes and saves him. His faith is poor, as Jesus will later say. Doesn't matter. We might be drowning in a terrible mess. But if we know at least where to address our prayers, to call for help, we're not beyond Jesus' reach. So Samson's death, yes, it's a triumph of faith. Yes, it's strength into weakness, echoing Hebrews 11:24. It demonstrates God's willingness to work with and work through imperfect humans. I like that. In Samson's final prayer, he asked to die with the Philistines. And the man who, let's be honest, he didn't demonstrate the separation that was required by God, that God wanted to see in his people. And he gets buried in the temple of Dagon, surrounded by Philistines, as he actually expected. Judges chapter 16 is a tragedy. It should never have happened. Samson's story should have finished in Judges chapter 15 with 20 years, the usual formula as to how a judge's life and rule is concluded. And that would have been perfect. Started badly, but he got there in the end. You beauty. But unfortunately, that's not how Samson's story goes. His wandering eyes lead right through into chapter 16, the misadventure in Gath, betrayal, and then death as a blind, broken man. Psalm 116, verse 15, is a verse which has troubled translators. The traditional King James has, precious in the eyes of the Lord are the death of all his saints. It doesn't quite fit the context of the character of God, like better to avoid the deaths. And I think the New Jewish Publication Society picks up the sense a little differently, picks up that idea of precious as heavy or costly. So it says grievous in the Lord's sight. And so the message, I think, how painful it is to the Lord when one of his people dies, is actually nails what the Hebrew probably means, what the idea is. Death hurts God. We know when the Lord died, when Jesus died, God darkened the sky, shook the earth. He was in pain. He grieves the loss, even if it's temporary, of his children. Samson had great highs and great lows, but the mercies of God go far. And his family come and they take the body of the judge. In Judges chapter 16, verse 31. They buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. He's finally home. This is where he emerged, Zorah and Eshtaol. This was the heartland that he was meant to free. Where over 20 years, 30 years, who knows exactly how long, where he emerged as a special child dedicated to God, full of promise. 20 years ago, God's Spirit was wrestling with him in this space. He was struggling to respond to that. But now, no more struggle. He's at rest. And I think probably saddest of all, it's not until Samson's death that you actually see his family, or anyone in Israel, actually take a positive action. He's never been able to lead the people. He's always been a one-man band. But finally, in his death, his family come and take his body. Samson concluded that he belonged among the bodies of his tormentors. He thought that was his final, appropriate, rational place for him to be, to die among the Philistines, buried in their temple. He thought he was pretty wretched. That's not how God saw him. That's not how God sees his children. might be down, but God never sees us as out of reach of his reach and his love. God rewrites Samson's conclusions. Bury me with the Philistines. No, says God, I'm not having it. And he writes our lives as well, rewrites our lives as well. The NRSV and others translate Psalm 87 this way. Among those who know me, I mention Egypt and Babylon, Philistia and Tyre and Ethiopia, all traditionally enemies of God's people and a long way from Israel. This one was born there, they say. And of Zion it said, this one and that one were born there, for the Most High will establish it. The Lord records as he registers his people. This one was born there. We might think we belong in Egypt. We might think we belong in a temple of Dagon. But God disagrees. And he rewrites our story just as he rewrote Samson's. And finally, he's reunited with the family. Blind, broken, dead, but not forgotten. And God changes the pattern of the judges to re-echo the conclusion, to put the final stamp on it in verse 31. He led Israel for 20 years. Hebrews 11 says, these all died in faith, witnesses not to human triumph, but to the power of God. That's why Samson's there, as showing God's willingness to work powerfully through imperfect humans, something which should compel us forward and give us hope.